My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I am going to do my somewhat anticipated review of Whoa, I thought this movie was supposed to be a cartoon. I mean, in all seriousness, it seems like the music is a tad melodramatic for an intro, and I kind of wonder if that was because they were worried about putting people off as an animated movie of J.R.R. Tolkien. And given what happened later with Rankin Bass, I can see why. But clearly they're going for a serious tone in this movie, and that will be something that I bring up later. But this is an interesting movie to analyze because it occupies a rather interesting niche, and so that's why I wanted to do this review. And before I get to my general thoughts, though, what I really wanted to do in this review is kind of discuss the similarities and differences to Peter Jackson's trilogy, because really that's what most people today are familiar with, and it really is kind of part of the modern pop culture. So if you've never seen this older version, this will be a nice intro. It'll give you an idea of the differences, but also it's useful just to compare and contrast, especially because Peter Jackson lifted several scenes directly from this version. So let's start with similarities, then I'll move on to contrasts, and then I'll get into more general topics about what I like and dislike about this 1978 version. And before I forget to mention, I should also say it's animated, but it's rotoscoped. And for those of you who don't know what it means, basically every scene was shot live action and then cells were animated in after. And I'll come back to that issue as well. But for now, let's talk about some similarities. Before I start the movie review, I do want to say, if you haven't already figured it out, I am on Patreon now. I will have that in the description below, the link to my page. And I've got two patrons so far. One of them is Jonathan Baltzly, and the other is Egovoice. And I just want to give a shout out to them because they both earned it for joining my Patreon. If you want to join yours, you can click the link below and check it out. I do have a tier system set up. And if you've got ideas for how I could improve that or things I should change, then do let me know in the comments. I'm pretty new to this, so definitely open to suggestions there. The similarities between the 1978 animated film and the Peter Jackson trilogy begin almost right off the bat with the prologue, which is rather similar.
Long ago, in the early years of the Second Age, the great elven smiths forged rings of power.
Now, the interesting thing about the prologue is it does very much start off with the idea of the creation of the rings and that sort of thing, and then it moves on into somewhat of the history of the ring, which I didn't show the whole intro there, but it kind of covers basically the same ground as Peter Jackson does, and it makes sense. You know, in the Lord of the Rings, you can kind of, in the novel, a lot of that background history comes in later, whereas with a movie, you don't want to have to interrupt the action, and so it makes sense to kind of upload, front load all that, really at the beginning. So that's one major similarity. Another interesting similarity is at Bilbo's birthday party. When Bilbo disappears, both in Peter Jackson's version and this version, Gandalf is completely unaware of the fact that Bilbo's going to do this, at least based on his reaction.
Goodbye.
And the reason I point this out is because in the book, of course, Gandalf knows from the start this is going to happen. And in fact, he sets off a bunch of fireworks right at the same time that Bilbo disappears. And later on, Bilbo kind of chides him and says, "You ruined my joke." And Gandalf said, "I thought they should have some other reason to attribute your sudden vanishment to." So he basically, he knew it was coming in the novel, but both movies make it seem as if he doesn't really have any idea what's coming. Some of the other, there's not really a whole lot of major similarities I want to get into, precisely because most of the ones that I find interesting are the ones that are departures from the book, and so I don't come across any other major similarities like that until much later in Moria, where we find the Balrog, like Peter Jackson's Balrog, has actual wings. Now this is interesting because in the novel, he doesn't have wings. It says there are shadows like wings. There's no indication in any of Tolkien's works that Balrogs had wings or could fly or anything like that. If you read the Silmarillion, you definitely don't get that impression. The shadow-like wings described in the novel is the closest you ever get. So I mean, adding wings really is kind of a creative license. And then the next major, and really I think the last major similarity that's kind of like this, as in Peter Jackson's film, where Éomer is not, as he is in the book, imprisoned after riding off and killing the Uruk-hai who took Merry and Pippin. He is instead banished at the order of Grima Wormtongue. So that is also true in the 1978 version. So there's some fairly key plot points, and you can kind of understand why some of these things get done, like Éomer, to do him as, being imprisoned, and then you have to bring him back out, and then you have to figure out some other person who's out there, which in the novel is Erkenbrand, who was the person who was in charge of Helm's Deep from the beginning. You have to bring in a lot of extra plot elements, which really makes the movie a lot longer if you're going to bring all that in. So it makes sense why they made some of these changes. Not really sure why you would make the change of Gandalf not knowing that Bilbo was planning to disappear. But at least some of these changes you can understand, and it's pretty obvious why. But I do want to go back and take a look at one more major similarity that's a famous similarity, but I'm going to do that a little bit later because it plays into some of the other stuff I want to talk to, but it's the scene where the hobbits hide from the Black Rider for the first time. If you've seen both movies, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and I will get back to it later. But I really want to use that scene to discuss something else, and I don't want to preempt that discussion yet. So now let's move into a discussion of contrasts. Now, a lot of the differences between the 1978 movie and Peter Jackson's trilogy come down to the amount of material the earlier version leaves out because it was drastically pared down from the original story. It covers most of the events through the end of the Two Towers in under 2.5 hours, whereas Peter Jackson's trilogy in the first two movies covers 6 to 7 hours of movie time, depending on whether you watch the theatrical cut, the extended edition, and just whatever, however much material you get, there's a ton more. So I want to save some of that discussion for a specific issue of brevity and what that implies for the movie. So for the differences part of this analysis, I want to focus on things that are particularly interesting in ways that this movie actually adheres to the source material, whereas Peter Jackson doesn't, or areas in which there's a difference that it doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense. And again, kind of going in chronological order, one of the first differences that kind of struck me was this scene where the Witch King, they don't know it's the Witch King yet, but the Witch King is riding after Frodo, who is riding Legolas's horse. That's a difference in and of itself. It's not Arwen, it's Legolas, but I'll come back to that later. And, well, watch the scene. So as we see there, when the Witch King kind of clutches his hand, not only Frodo feels the effects, but Asfaloth, the horse, also falls. And it doesn't seem to be because Frodo is reining it in too hard. It seems to be that the horse itself is just having problems. This is weird to me for a few reasons. First of which being, I can understand from the source material why it would affect Frodo. That, in fact, does happen in the source material. But if he can control the horse to that degree, why is he not just making the horse inoperable and then catching up with Frodo and taking him? It doesn't make any sense. So, it's kind of a weird scene. Some of the other differences that we see are the fact that the pronunciation in this movie is not only not always accurate, but it's kind of all over the map. For example,
my cousin Balin Daruman Adoris.
So you could see there that we got Balin instead of Balin. We got Edoras instead of Edoras. We get Ahriman instead of Saruman, kind of hard to catch. And I mean, just some of the pronunciation decisions they made are weird, but also inexcusable. There's an appendix in The Lord of the Rings that tells you how to pronounce everything. But what makes it weirder is the fact that the pronunciation is also just kind of all over the map. For example, when Gandalf first uses the name of Edoras, he says Edoras. And then John Hurt, playing Aragorn, says it the same way. But then just a few minutes later, he says Edoras. And so it's like, well, why can't you just make up your mind which way you want to say it? Similarly, for Saruman, originally they start using Saruman, but then later on they start going with Ahriman. And the story behind that is allegedly they thought that Sauron and Saruman were too similar, and so they cut the S, but then some of them they didn't, and it just ended up being a mixed bag. But either way, it's like, that's really poor production quality. That could have been improved so much. So there's the pronunciation issue, which is not to say that Peter Jackson's is perfect. I think there are a few places where they mess up some pronunciation, but by and large, Peter Jackson's movies do a pretty good job. So it's definitely a weird element of the 1978 movie. Going back to specific scenes, we've got the Moria doors, and at the Moria doors, Pippin says this:
I have never seen anything Mr. Gandalf couldn't do.
Oh, Sam, fireworks are all very nice, but this is elf magic.
And what's weird here is everybody knows that this is a dwarven door. Actually, in the movie, Legolas makes a comment to Gimli about how the dwarves made it impossible to open. So why is Pippin saying it's elf magic? It doesn't make any sense. Also, at the doors, we see that Bill the pony is with them the whole time, and apparently they're planning to bring Bill into the mines, whereas that's never the case in either the book or the Peter Jackson movie. And then at the end, Bill gets apparently killed / eaten by the Watcher in the water, which is unnecessarily depressing, but also it doesn't make any sense. How are you going to take Bill the pony through the mines of Moria? At any rate, that was just a weird difference that I thought was worth noting. Another really big difference in this one, of course, in terms of accuracy to the source material, is Frodo's role in the whole thing, because Frodo in this movie is actually a lot closer to the novel version of Frodo than Peter Jackson's version, because Frodo in here actually takes a much more active role. We actually see several of the things that he does in the book. For example, he's the one that makes the decision to leave the Shire with the ring. He attacks the troll or whatever it is that sticks its foot in through the door in the room where Balin's tomb is in Moria. He attacks the Witch King at Weathertop. So we see a lot of things that Frodo does that are much more like the book than the movie, and than Peter Jackson's movies, I should say. And I don't want to cover all of that here in clips. I just want to kind of give a summary, but that is definitely something that goes on. Another one is Gollum. Gollum actually, in some ways, is slightly more accurate to the novel than Peter Jackson's version. And I think the best way to kind of show that is with the scene where he's having the internal debate with himself.
Smeagol promised. Yes, we promised to save our precious, never to let him have it, but it's going to him, our precious, yes, nearer every step. I can't help it. Smeagol promised to help nice Hobbit. He took a cruel rope off our leg.
So we can see here that he's having this back and forth, and the back and forth is actually much closer to the source material than Peter Jackson's is. Peter Jackson's is a very good scene, and it's very compelling, but it's slightly different, and the outcome is the outcome is very different than the source material. So, in the original, in the novel, and in the 1978 movie, we see Gollum kind of ending with the idea of she could help us, meaning, of course, Shelob. In Peter Jackson's movie, that doesn't come up until much later after the incident with Faramir and all these other things, which doesn't even happen in these movies. And in fact, going back to differences, we're talking about differences. One of the interesting things about this movie is you get the impression that the internal debate scene here happens when they're almost to Mordor, which makes you think they skipped Faramir entirely, which would kind of make sense given the amount of material they skipped. Another interesting difference here is what the interpretation of these two different movies of the devilry of Orthanc that is used to blast a hole in the walls at Helm's Deep is. In Peter Jackson's movies, of course, we see that the Uruk-hai are putting basically bombs under the walls and they blow it up. In this movie, however, we get this. And so we get the impression here that, in fact, they interpreted it more as purely magical, some, the devilry of Orthanc taken almost literally as something coming from the Tower of Orthanc all the way to Helm's Deep and then blowing a hole in the wall. Which one makes more sense in terms of Tolkien's writing? I leave to your judgment, but it's definitely worth noting. Those are some of the key differences that popped out to me. There's plenty more, of course, but some of them I'm going to cover in another section, and there may be others that kind of fit this general theme, but those are the ones that really stood out to me. Now let's take a look at the difference in terms of how much material got cut from this movie and see what that implies for it as a movie. Alright, so the amount of material cut from this movie compared to the source material is really staggering. Like I said, this movie is less than 2.5 hours long, and yet it covers almost all the material through the end of the Two Towers. And when I say Two Towers, I mean the book, not Peter Jackson's movie. Compared to Peter Jackson's movie, again, depending on whether you count the Faramir scene, if Faramir was actually cut from this movie, which is not entirely clear, then you could say it covers pretty much everything for Peter Jackson's Two Towers. But anyway, taking a look at what was cut here, and there's a lot, one of the things that it does is it tends to make events a little bit hard to follow. It cuts very rapidly from scene to scene, and if you're not paying attention, you might miss what's going on. And then it also creates weird instances where you're kind of left with plot holes. And one good instance is at Bree, Butterbur at first refers to Frodo as Mr. Underhill because that's the name he's going under to hide the fact that he's a Baggins. And then later when he's talking with Frodo in his room and Strider or Aragorn is there, he ends up calling him Mr. Baggins, and it's never explained how he knows who his name is. So it's not really, if you filled in the extra storyline that was there, then you do get that information. But in this movie, we lose all that, and so we're left wondering, wait, how did you know his name was Baggins? As far as we knew, you just knew him as Underhill. So that's one small aspect of how that works out. Another aspect of this is they really cut short a lot of the, I guess you could call it downtime, where they're doing stuff, but they're not really doing anything that's crucial to the action. So in the trip from Rivendell to Moria, we see in this movie a scene where they're trudging through very bad snowstorms, that sort of thing, but there's never any discussion of Caradhras, the pass over the mountains, or anything like that. It just shows us what they're doing, and then the next thing you know, they're discussing going to Moria, and Aragorn doesn't want to go, and so you just miss a lot of material there, and it's not really clear. If you know the story, then you're seeing the snowstorm, and you're thinking, okay, that's Caradhras they're trying to walk over, and yet there's no debate or anything that goes on. A final major example that I want to bring up is, unlike Peter Jackson's movie, they actually entirely cut out any meeting between Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and Éomer and his riders. There is no meeting between them whatsoever. We see Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli on the chase. We see the battle of Éomer with the Uruk-hai, and then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli find the scene of the battle. They don't have any encounter with the riders at all. I mean, this is how much material was cut. And like I said earlier, it really does impact the flow of the movie. I mean, you could piece it all together, but it moves at a rapid pace, and it really keeps you on your toes. If you're not really paying attention to the transitions, 30 minutes in, you'll be wondering, wait, where are we? What's going on? I lost my place. You'll have to rewind the movie. You really have to either know the story or be paying really good attention the whole way through to really catch everything. So the final thing I'll point out, just as far as the brevity issue, it is well done to the extent that you can do it well and cut as much material as they did. They cut an enormous amount of material, and yet the movie is still watchable, and most of the stuff that they cut really is non-essential in the sense of you don't have to have it to explain the plot or follow what's going on. It's not really essential. And it's amazing how much they managed to cut and still have all the essential elements. What's even more interesting in some ways is some of the things that they did keep that weren't all that essential and yet were very accurate to the book. I was kind of surprised, and it had been a long time since I'd seen it, so I didn't remember all of it, but some of the things that they kept surprised me in a good way, in the sense that how much material they did cut. I was happy they kept some of the things that they did because they really are worth keeping. But that's my discussion of the brevity. Now let's move into a little bit more of a general discussion of things I like and don't like about the movie. Okay, let's talk about characters first. One of the things, and not just, main characters, but even, side characters and whatnot. The first thing I want to mention goes back to the hobbits hiding under the tree scene. So let me just show you the clip. So in this scene, we see the Black Rider for the first time, and this is really the first impression we get of them, and I think it's pretty good overall. I do think the bit at the end where he's kind of like, that's a little weird. Also, there's this scene at the end of the stay at Bree, which is a little odd. I'm not sure what all that wailing and screaming is about. Other than those two things, though, and the fact that the Black Rider is really hunched over and seems like a cripple, to me, the Black Riders in this movie are actually creepier, if anything, than in Peter Jackson's. And the music, the music in Peter Jackson's is great music, but for my money, the music that they put along with the Black Rider in the scenes where, especially the one at the tree, very, very fear-inducing. I think it does a really good job of making them very terrifying. So I think they did a good job overall with the Black Riders. And of course, we later see images of them rotoscoped and different view of them when Frodo puts on the ring and whatnot. And it's a lot. I mean, it's not even really clear enough to see much. They're clearly in armor and whatnot, but you can't really tell much beyond that. So I'm not even going to bother showing. But the scenes where we see them robed and whatnot, that's pretty creepy for my money. I think that actually does a really good job. Another thing about characters that I mentioned before, Gollum is arguably, in this movie, and I'm including all movies here, Peter Jackson's, the Rankin Bass films, everything, this might be the most accurate depiction of Gollum. It's hard to say because they all have kind of pluses and minuses, but this one is definitely a good one. So, one major thing, for example, from Peter Jackson, Gollum in the books is not described as having like a cat-like hack. That's not Tolkien's Gollum. Likewise, however, Rankin Bass actually does a slightly better version of that because it's Gollum, which is more accurate because it is supposed to be kind of a swallowing sound. Nevertheless, the one in this movie is pretty good. So that's another one where I think they did a pretty good job. It's not perfect. Another thing that they did, I think, well, is that he's clearly heavily emaciated. I mean, in the Peter Jackson movies, he's clearly not well fed, but in here, I mean, you see all the bones sticking out, and I think that really speaks to his character and why you would pity him. One minor comment about the hobbits, they seem just a little bit too tall. They all seem like they're close to 4 to 4.5 feet in the scenes where you can actually see them close up with full-sized, humans and elves and whatnot. Whereas 4 is considered pretty tall. 4 feet is tall for a hobbit. So they tend to seem a little bit too tall here, and they do have a wide variety of heights, though. I mean, you can actually see, like, Frodo compared to Bilbo. Frodo is significantly taller, and that does make sense. In the novel, Tolkien does point out that they can range between 3 to 4 feet, so it makes sense that there would be some variation. All right, a couple of just general notes about some of the characters. Why is Aragorn so reminiscent of a Native American? Why is Boromir so much like a barbarian? And the reason I say this particularly because Boromir is supposed to be from basically kind of like the height of civilization for this part of the world in this era. Gondor is the most advanced civilization there is, and he's rather specifically described in the book such that, the Peter Jackson portrayal really fits. Whereas this one, I'm not sure what what that whole outfit is supposed to be about. Similarly, Legolas, it's not consistent. I'm going to show you the worst example, but Legolas sometimes looks just a little weird. Those eyes are creepy. Like I said, it's not consistent, and it seems to get better as the movie goes on, but it's really, really weird how that worked out. Two of the other things that I would say about Legolas and Aragorn, these are really almost the only two famous actors in the entire movie. Aragorn is played by John Hurt, which I really like his voice acting in this movie. I love Aragorn in this movie. He is well played. He is much more accurate to the book. He's a dynamic, active leader character, whereas in the Peter Jackson movie, he's, he only leads by necessity, and he's kind of I don't want to be a bad guy like Isildur. I don't like that portrayal. Partially because I think we need at least one good, strong character besides Gandalf, who is supposed to be, he's an angel, basically. So you need a human who fills that role, I think, and Aragorn's role is supposed to be like that. And then Legolas is played by Anthony Daniels, more famously known for C-3PO in the Star Wars universe. And if you didn't know that, you probably wouldn't guess. But if you really listen, you can kind of tell, oh yeah, that's the same person, just using a slightly lower register than he does in Star Wars. But anyway, that doesn't really have anything to do with his portrayal. I think Legolas is most of the characters, to be honest, don't get a whole lot of screen time simply because the movie's cut so short. Legolas and Gimli don't get a lot of action. Boromir and Aragorn kind of get a lot of what goes on in the early part because they have to make some room for Boromir. Aragorn, of course, is a major character regardless. So Legolas and Gimli are not as well developed, but we do get some of their stuff. The other major character that I would reference in this regard is Sam. Sam gets a lot of flack in this movie for being overly silly, largely because of this one scene.
Me go, sir. Me go and see the elves. Oh, my. Oh, hooray!
Now, okay, that portrayal is over the top. He is crazy silly in that scene, and the way he's drawn also lends a huge amount of silliness to him, just generally. His appearance, it's comic. And in the book, he is supposed to be comic, but they really kind of overplay their hand. But on the other hand, in Peter Jackson's movie, he's, if anything, too far to the other extreme. So the thing is, if you can get past this one scene where he goes crazy over elves, you actually get a pretty good portrayal of Sam. He actually is pretty true to the book, other than probably his ugly comic appearance. But, he does do a pretty good job of, the movie does a good job of portraying Sam as he is in the book otherwise. So I think they actually did a pretty good job with him if they had just toned down this one scene. Now, a few non-major characters, there's the orcs are kind of interesting in this movie. Most of them are pretty generic. But then there's this scene just before the Balrog shows up in Moria where we get this guy. And here's a view of him from a little bit further out so you can actually see the whole, the whole shebang, his whole outfit. Now, I don't know what that's supposed to be. I don't know why you'd be wearing a ghillie suit in mines, but it's just really weird. The other interesting thing about orcs in this movie is the Uruk-hai look like sand people. Now, take a look at this and say I'm wrong. And even my wife, who, by the way, is a huge Star Wars fan, randomly walked in while I was watching this movie, saw some Uruk-hai and said, "Why are there sand people in this movie?" Seriously, they look like sand people from Star Wars. It's just weird. The only other thing that I want to mention as far as characters goes is Treebeard. Treebeard, we get very, very little Treebeard in this movie. Basically, he meets Merry and Pippin, they have a short conversation, and that's it. There are two things that I would like to point out, because there's too little really to go on. One of them is, while he's talking, he's constantly spouting leaves. And you're like, what is that? But, on the flip side, the voice that they give to Treebeard, I think, is actually probably truer to what Tolkien intended, because Tolkien kind of describes it as almost kind of a woodwindy kind of voice, where it's, very hollow and deep. And whereas in the Peter Jackson movie, Treebeard has this really raspy voice, and, it's done for a different type of effect. So in that sense, Treebeard is more accurate in this movie, although he does look rather comical, you have to say. And I'll show you an image, I guess. Here's Treebeard, and he looks so not like a normal tree, and yet Merry and Pippin are like, "We thought you were just a tree. How could you mistake that for a tree? It's way too top-heavy." Anyway, so that's characters. Now let's move on to something else. Alright, now I'm going to get into some more just general comments. One of the things that I noticed about this movie, and it's not a thing that I like, the background scenery in a lot of cases is very vague and very even surreal at times. The up-close shots where you get to see characters and whatnot, you don't really notice it as much, but when you get wide pan shots, like Gandalf riding to Isengard, floating down the river Anduin after Lothlorien, you get a lot of different things where the scenery is just bizarre looking, and you can't even tell that there's any real shape to it. Not really a huge fan of that. You also have a couple of scenes where Gandalf goes kind of weird, and the biggest example of that is this scene right after Pippin throws the pebble into the well in Moria. Check this out.
Pippin?
Oh, just a stone. I dropped a stone.
Fool of a took. Throw yourself in next time. Be quiet. You fool of a Pippin. Won't you? Won't you?
Now, okay, Gandalf is supposed to be upset here, but he goes off and just starts mumbling, and you can't even tell that he's saying anything coherent. And it's just like, wow, what was that? So, I mean, you got weird stuff like that. Another weird one, too, that also just doesn't make any sense, but is a totally different kind of not making sense. In the Battle for Helm's Deep, you get the Riders of Rohan standing up on the walls, and they have these perfectly good, pillars to stand behind for cover, and yet they're just standing there stock still while the orcs are shooting arrows, and we see several of them that get killed. And you're wondering, why aren't you just taking cover behind that thing that's literally right next to you? Just didn't make any sense. Another interesting thing is, as I mentioned before, the rotoscoping. Sometimes it's really obvious, sometimes you can't tell it's there at all. In most of the scenes where you've got, action sequences and up-close shots of main characters, it's all cel-shaded. You can't tell at all. A lot of the non-main characters or wide shots, you get a lot more obvious rotoscoping, probably because they just didn't feel like cel-shading in all those, frames. But anyway, it's just it creates a rather interesting dynamic because you're constantly getting this contrast between really well-drawn, cel-shaded stuff and then stuff that's barely shaded at all, just totally rotoscoped. And so it's weird to look at sometimes, but it also kind of highlights the fact that you are looking at different types of characters, different types of scenes, that sort of thing. Also, there's the issue of the clothing. I mean, like I said before, the orcs are kind of generic. You get more or less the same thing over and over. But that also kind of holds true for everybody else. I mean, if you look at everybody's outfits, there's nothing terribly detailed about any of them. And probably that comes down to the fact that it's a hand-drawn, cel-shaded stuff. You wouldn't want to spend enormous amounts of time on a 2-hour and 14-minute, I think, is roughly the runtime. All of that drawing, I'm sure, is probably why they didn't do it. But you do just get so many outfits that are just so generic. I mean, everybody kind of looks the same in terms of how they dress, except you got Boromir, who looks like a barbarian, and then Legolas, who's in this white flowy outfit. Most everybody else, and Elrond is a really good example of this. Let me show you a photo of Elrond here. He's so plain looking, and it's like he's supposed to be like the foremost elf lord other than, maybe Celeborn in Middle Earth at this point, and yet he is so plainly dressed. It's just weird. But I mean, that's just one of those things that I thought was kind of odd watching this again. I never really noticed it when I was young, but probably I've been spoiled by Peter Jackson, who put so much attention to detail into costumes and stuff. But it was just an interesting thing to note. So when all is said and done, what do I think about this movie, especially now that I've watched it again after many years of having not watched it and having seen Peter Jackson's movie? Well, that's complicated. I really enjoy this movie for the way in which it accurately portrays a lot of things that Peter Jackson either changes or leaves out or, otherwise just kind of messes up. Because in a lot of ways, this is the most accurate adaptation of Tolkien's material. Well, The Hobbit by Rankin Bass might be more accurate just in terms of not really changing anything, but also it still leaves out a lot. But considering they squeezed two parts of the Lord of the Rings trilogy into this one movie, it's amazing how much of the main thrust of the story they kept and how accurate it was. So I enjoy that. I also enjoy the fact that it is more serious in tone than the Rankin Bass movies. Although the Rankin Bass Lord of the Rings does have its merit. Just the Return of the King is the only one they did. And the Rankin Bass Hobbit, of course, is actually, if anything, maybe slightly more serious than the source material. I'm going to have to do a review of those eventually, although getting my hands on a Rankin Bass Return of the King might be difficult. It seems like it's out of print. So maybe that'll come later, maybe it won't. At any rate, getting back to this movie, as I mentioned before, I really enjoy the way they portray Aragorn in this movie. Gandalf is hit or miss. Sam, like I mentioned, is good, except for that one scene where they really overplay it. The biggest problem this movie has is the amount of material they cut, which, as I said, does make it hard to keep up if you're not really paying attention and you don't already know the story. The pronunciation issue is another thing that I don't like. It's not a huge deal, but it's really annoying when they switch between pronunciations. It's bad enough if you're going to have a wrong pronunciation, but do you really have to change the pronunciation mid-movie? And it just makes things even more confusing. So you get all these weird things going on. And then overall, I can't say I like it better than Peter Jackson's, because Peter Jackson did a great job of being attentive to detail and all that stuff, but I do think this movie is definitely worth having in your collection because it does hit a lot of things. It hits a lot of notes that Peter Jackson's does not. It doesn't radically change any characters. It does cover some material that Peter Jackson's doesn't, which is weird because they had way less time to do it. And it's definitely an enjoyable watch. Now, I will say it does have its moments. Even though it's animated, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, how the music gave you the very clear impression this is not just a cartoon, there are some elements in here where you get animated blood. And so, I mean, like at the end where they're at Helm's Deep and Gandalf rides in with Éomer, you get some scenes of slow-mo orc killing where blood kind of splashes across the screen, or, the viewing, the point of view. So it's definitely not kid-friendly just because it's a animated movie. That is something to keep in mind. But for anybody of the right age, it is enjoyable. And I remember enjoying this as a kid. Even, to be honest, I can't remember how well I followed the story as a kid because it's been so long. But even now, well, back then I didn't mind so much if I couldn't follow the story anyway. But even now, I recognize that the story is just a little hard to keep up with, so that is a mark against it. So it's definitely not a great movie by any means, but it is an enjoyable watch, and it is something that I think fills, like I mentioned earlier, a very specific niche in the Tolkien movie genre, because it does hit so many notes that Peter Jackson and the Rankin Bass films, for that matter, don't hit. And so for that reason, I definitely do recommend it. I'm not going to give it a number rating. I think that's kind of pointless for this, because it's just so, I mean, putting this on a scale and then putting Peter Jackson's on a scale, they're not the same thing. But I do think you should own it if you can get a good copy of it. If you've never seen it, it's definitely worth a watch, just because you will see things that are interesting. Rotoscoping was a really big deal. It was the first movie that was completely rotoscoped. There's just a lot of interesting things about this movie when it came out that were pretty groundbreaking, and the fact that they got Tolkien onto the big screen at all was a big deal at the time. So nowadays we tend to forget that because Peter Jackson has made it kind of, well, of course, but back then nobody thought it could be done, and yet Ralph Bakshi came along and he actually did it, and he did a pretty good job of it. It wasn't perfect. Not everything in it was done right, I don't think, but it was definitely done well considering what they had to work with, which is 2.25 hours and covering 2 books worth of material. So all things considered, definitely a good movie in those terms. Not, I would say, a good movie for a non-Tolkien fan, because if you're not really interested in the source material, you're not going to probably pay enough attention to follow. But if you're really into Tolkien, pick this movie up. It's definitely worth having. So, hope you enjoyed that video. If you haven't seen the Bakshi film, then I hope this gave you an idea whether you want to watch it. If you have seen it and you have different opinions, please share those in the comments below. Definitely interested to talk about that. Glad to have this in my collection after so many years, because it definitely does, it fills a hole. You know, I mean, Peter Jackson does just enough things wrong that it's good to have this other one over here on the shelf that I can go back to. Anyway, if you want to support the channel, you can do that at my Patreon link below in the description. If you want to, please do like the video and share it around. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here. And if you want to check out a couple of my previous videos, they're up here. And until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.